seminars, and to the Unbinding Prometheus, Shelley Mook. We are now looking at Act 1 from about line 600 to the end of the first act. And we're going to go around the room, and we're going to talk about some of the ideas that come to us and some of the questions that we have. And we're going to talk about it. And hopefully our talk will continue to inspire your conversations online. So, Daniel, I'd like to ask you if you would like to begin from where Prometheus says, remit the anguish of that lighted step.
Great. So this speech that Prometheus gives here, I think, is particularly interesting because he's addressing the Christ figure, and there's two different kinds of inversions of how we generally think of the Christ figure, I think, happening here. The first one is Prometheus is comforting Christ, telling him to remit the anguish, close those wan lips, let that thorn-wounded brow stream not with blood, it mingles with thy tears. And this is maybe a little, not traditionally how we think of Christ as being the object of the sympathy, right? We think of him as kind of this larger-than-life transcendent figure, and Shelley's almost positioning Prometheus as if we're going to have a hierarchy of martyrs, as higher up in that chain than Christ, which is interesting, I think. And then I guess the second kind of shift we get is after the comfort for Prometheus comforts Christ, the man, and then we get this shift to maybe more of a criticism of institutionalized religion as it is in Shelley's context, right? After the comforting scene, you have, "O horrible, thy name I will not speak, it hath become a curse." So there's this transition here from what Christ spoke to what is now being carried out in his name. And Prometheus proclaims that the wise, the mild, the lofty, and the just, a group of seemingly good people, are being hated for being Christ-like themselves, right? And the thy slaves there, I think, is an interesting, I think maybe we can talk about that. I read that as the slaves to Christ, the church leaders, figures in institutionalized religions who are maybe co-opting this message, that the Christ message, and using it to carry out wars and maybe things that are economically prosperous for the church but aren't necessarily in the vein of what Christ would have liked.
So going back to Chaucer, Chaucer has quite a lot of fun with people who use the church for their own personal gain. He's mining a rich tradition here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great comparison.
But I saw you nodding your head rather in agreement.
Yes, yes.
So is there something you might want to add to that?
No, I was nodding because I thought it was very well put, and this can be a difficult passage because you encounter a crucifix and a thorn-wounded brow, and then your cultural information sensor, SEMSR, kicks in, and it's Jesus on the cross, and what is Shelley doing with Jesus? And so I thought Dan did a really great job of also bringing out saying what it is, and bringing out the irony of those who are following the imitatio Christi and living the imitation of Christ, which is what Christians are supposed to be doing, are the ones who are persecuted for being like him, for being Christ-like, as Dan said. So I thought that was an excellent point. And so I would say that Shelley, one of his problems with religion is the hypocrites in religion, as well as using the name of religion to do things for one's own good.
So, one thing that I like about this passage is it gives me the opportunity to switch places from the place in which I normally would be in looking at the Christ figure and the suffering of the Christ, which is that, normally so this is... But here, because the chain has been shifted, I become freer to move almost in a 360-degree moral arc around the crucifixion and see it as not merely playing out for Christ, but playing out for Prometheus, and also in a sense playing out for mankind. That all of mankind is in the sense suffering on the cross for the power of tyranny, because once you evacuate an all-omnipotent and all-moral heaven and replace it with a heaven that feels a bit more like the powers of this world, then you get the opportunity to begin the process of breaking free. I may have put that in a confusing way, but anything else, Daniel, you want to add to this?
No, I think just I agree with what you just said. I think Shelley's he's trying to almost use Prometheus to displace the Christ figure. It's like maybe not a secular Christ figure, something that will, because as we get to the end, obviously Prometheus becomes this great martyr, and what will become in the end of Act 4, their attempt to build a new paradise, not the Edenic paradise, but will be a new version of that that's not tied to this religion, but kind of built out of love and joy and hope and wisdom and these things that we encounter in Act 4.
And one that we are going to be responsible for.
Sure.
Morally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So not just one imposed from on high or gifted on high,
yes,
but one created by our moral agency.
Yes. Yeah, that's very well put.
So what does that fury tell us next after the Prometheus speech?
Oh, so the fury or the Prometheus speech ends with, after we get that transition to maybe criticizing institutionalized religion, we get kind of this litany of ways in which those the wise, mild, lofty, and the just are being persecuted and suffering. So there's kind of this, this slew of ugly images, if I don't have a better word for it, and the fury claims that you can see these things, but there are worse things at play. And then in the preceding sections, which I believe we'll talk about, the fury kind of gives his own litany of what he perceives to be worse than what Prometheus has already laid out, and then Prometheus will have a rebuttal to that. And I think this section's interesting because you have these two big long sections between Prometheus and then the one that we're coming to discuss from the other fury, and I think they have different conceptions of pity. They're arguing over who deserves more pity, and I think the fury maybe doesn't recognize the Promethean notion of pity, because I think they're using the word in two different ways, and the Prometheus is going to resonate more in the rest of the play. His notion of pity is more of like a spiritual, internal, and it's governed by a moralistic compass. And the fury is, I think, dealing with pity in a very physical sense. He pities those who are experiencing physical pain, whereas Prometheus is pitying those who are, perhaps morally corrupt.
So there's different levels of torture going on, and we got one level with Mercury,
sure,
which is like literally like, listen, mate, I'm coming in, and there's going to be some bones broken. But this level, the level of the French Revolution, of Christ on the cross, this is the spiritual desolation of watching the good things in the world be destroyed, and I think that's where we change our notion of pity to something bigger and thicker and heavier.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also potentially more empowering. So I'm going to pick up from where you were to talk about this, what I think is an amazing little speech from the Fury, in which he says, "In each human heart, terror survives the ravine it has gorged. The loftiest fear, and all that would disdain to think were true, hypocrisy and custom make their minds the fane of many a worship now outworn." So, just before he says, well, look, you can see the fire, you can see the blood, you can hear the groans, but there are worse things that you have not even imagined yet. And the reason for this is because the human heart endures suffering and then is capable of even more. It's like we by surviving suffering, we become capable of taking even more awfulness. But here, he does this thing with the word feign and worship. And I'm just going to ask you, Elizabeth, as my philologist on my left hand, to talk about the word feign and where that comes from.
Okay, so the word feign in English comes from the word phanos in Greek. Phanos would be how it would be transliterated into English. And the word that we know that has phanos in it is epiphany, which means the showing forth of God outside the temple, and some people call it theophany, the showing forth of theos. But interestingly enough, to go on a slight tangent, the word theos is the word Zeus, which is also the word deus. So the Catholic prayers, which pray to Deus in Latin, are actually, in a way, praying to the god, which used to be Zeus.
So Zeus is still buried in the prayer.
He's still buried. We can't get rid of
Yeah,
him.
we can't.
That
Yes.
tyrant, Jove, Zeus, Jupiter. So anyway,
But that points
Phanos,
to-
the human minds are making themselves a temple, and yes, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, well, this is part of the problem that Shelley recognizes, and it's a problem that language poetry often thematizes, which is that in the base, in the root of the language that we inherit, are already these heavy traditions that almost crush us, and which we have to be very wily to find a way out of.
And some critics have said, some feminists and some post-colonialists have said, we're using the oppressor's language. So, but it's interesting how Shelley uses the language of the oppressors
Right.
to free himself and free us through Prometheus and to get humankind free.
So at this point, I'm going to just say we're going to have a clip of Muhammad Ali on the Michael Parkinson show from I believe it might be 1970 or 1974, where he talks about the language that he grew up with. So listen to Muhammad Ali for a couple of minutes and think about how language helps us and hurts us to understand the world that we're living in and to the oppression that we have to endure and change.
And yet poets through this language become free and make us free. So that's part of the project, isn't it?
And Muhammad Ali, not only a great boxer, but in a way a really great poet and great reader of the language in which